Epicurus is perhaps the most misunderstood philosopher in Western history. His name became synonymous with gluttony, excess, and hedonistic pleasure-seeking. Yet the real Epicurus taught something radically different, something that threatened the power structures of his time and continues to challenge our assumptions today. Born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, Epicurus created a philosophical system so comprehensive and so dangerous to established religion and politics that his opponents spent centuries distorting his legacy. The early Christians burned his writings. The Stoics mocked him. Medieval scholars condemned him. And yet his ideas survived, whispered through the centuries, copied in secret, influencing thinkers from Thomas Jefferson to Karl Marx, from John Stuart Mill to Michel Onfray. What made Epicureanism so threatening? It offered a complete alternative to how human beings should live, grounded not in gods or kings or abstract duties, but in nature, reason, and the pursuit of a very specific kind of happiness. This was philosophy as liberation, as therapy, as a systematic method for achieving tranquility in a chaotic world. Part 1. The Garden and the Revolution. To understand Epicurus, we must first understand the world he was rejecting. 4th century BCE Athens was a city still reeling from the Peloponnesian War, still processing the execution of Socrates, still caught between the old religious certainties and the new philosophical questioning. Plato had established his academy, teaching that true reality existed in a realm of eternal forms, that the body was a prison, that earthly pleasures were shadows and illusions. His student Aristotle had created his own school, the Lyceum, arguing that happiness required virtue, political engagement, and a kind of aristocratic excellence available only to the educated elite. Into this world, around 307 or 306 BCE, Epicurus returned to Athens and did something revolutionary. He bought a house with a garden outside the city walls and opened a school that welcomed everyone, men and women, slaves and free people, Greeks and foreigners. The sign above the entrance reportedly read, "Stranger, here you will do well to tarry, here our highest good is pleasure." This was scandalous. Not just the mixing of social classes and genders, though that alone was radical, but the explicit elevation of pleasure, hedon in Greek, as the highest good, the telos, the ultimate aim of human life. But here is where the distortion begins, where we must proceed carefully. When Epicurus said pleasure is the highest good, he did not mean what his critics then and now have claimed he meant. He was not advocating drunken revelry or sexual excess or gormandizing. In fact, Epicurus himself lived on bread, water, and occasionally some cheese as a treat. He was known for his frugality, his simple lifestyle, his modest needs. So what did he mean? Epicurus made a crucial distinction that most of his critics ignore or misunderstand. He divided pleasures into two fundamental categories: kinetic pleasures and katastematic pleasures. Kinetic pleasures, from the Greek word for motion, are the active pleasures of satisfying a desire, the pleasure of eating when hungry, drinking when thirsty, the sensation of scratching an itch. These are real pleasures, but they are temporary, dependent on having a lack or need that can be filled. Katastematic pleasures are something entirely different. The word comes from katastema, meaning a state of being. These are the pleasures of equilibrium, of not being in pain, of not being disturbed. When you are not hungry, not thirsty, not cold, not anxious, not afraid, you are in a state of katastematic pleasure. This is what Epicurus called ataraxia, usually translated as tranquility or unperturbedness, and aponia, the absence of physical pain. And here is the radical claim. Epicurus argued that these katastematic pleasures, these states of equilibrium, are actually the highest form of pleasure, superior to kinetic pleasures. Once you have achieved ataraxia and aponia, you cannot increase your pleasure, only vary it. The pleasure of a simple meal when you are hungry is fundamentally no greater than the pleasure of an extravagant feast. Both satisfy hunger, both remove pain, both return you to equilibrium. This turns conventional thinking upside down. Most people chase after more, bigger, better, assuming that happiness scales with acquisition. Epicurus says no, there is a limit to pleasure, and that limit is the removal of all pain and disturbance. Once you reach that state, you have achieved the maximum pleasure possible. Everything beyond that is just variation, not increase. This has profound implications. It means that the good life, the life of maximum pleasure, is actually achievable by almost anyone. You do not need wealth, power, fame, or luxury. You need only enough to secure the natural and necessary desires: food, water, shelter, safety, friendship. Everything else is either natural but unnecessary, like sexual pleasure or fine food, or both unnatural and unnecessary, like fame or political power. This is why Epicurus created the garden as a community of friends, living simply outside the city. It was a practical demonstration, a living experiment in his philosophy. The Epicureans grew their own food, shared their resources, studied together, and sought to achieve collective ataraxia. It was not a monastery or a commune in the modern sense, but something between a philosophical school, a therapy group, and an intentional community. The historical evidence we have, primarily from Diogenes Laertius writing centuries later, and from fragments preserved in the works of critics and in the volcanic ash of Herculaneum, reveals a highly organized community. Epicurus wrote prolifically, reportedly more than 300 works, though only fragments survive. He wrote letters to his students, systematic treatises on nature, ethics, and proper living, and perhaps most importantly, the principal doctrines, 40 maxims summarizing his philosophy, designed to be memorized and repeated as a kind of cognitive therapy. One of the most important of these doctrines addresses what Epicurus saw as the primary source of human unhappiness: irrational fear. Specifically, fear of the gods and fear of death. These two fears, he argued, poison human life, creating constant anxiety and preventing ataraxia. His solution was radical for his time and remains controversial today. The gods, if they exist, are perfect beings living in a state of perfect happiness. Perfect beings, by definition, need nothing and want nothing. They do not create the world, they do not intervene in human affairs, they do not punish or reward, they do not care about human behavior. To think otherwise is to make the gods less than perfect, to attribute human emotions and concerns to beings that are fundamentally beyond such limitations. This was not atheism in the modern sense. Epicurus seemed to believe gods existed, but they were utterly irrelevant to human life. You could admire them as examples of perfect tranquility, but you should not fear them, pray to them, or expect anything from them. This effectively eliminated religion as a source of moral authority or existential comfort. The implications for his society were explosive. If the gods do not care about human behavior, then divine law is a fiction. If the gods do not punish wrongdoing in an afterlife, then appeals to cosmic justice are empty. If the gods do not intervene in nature, then natural disasters are just physical events, not divine judgments. Epicurus was systematically dismantling the entire edifice of Greek religion, and by extension much of the social order that depended on it. And then there was death, the other great fear. Here, Epicurus deployed an argument so simple and so disturbing that it has been debated ever since. Death, he said, is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not present. When death is present, we do not exist. Therefore, we never encounter death. It is neither good nor bad for us, because it is literally nothing for us. All sensation and consciousness end with death, so there is no one left to experience being dead. This argument assumes something crucial, that the self is identical with the body, that consciousness is a product of physical atoms configured in a particular way, and that when the body dissolves, consciousness dissolves with it. This is where Epicurus's physics becomes essential to his ethics, and we will need to explore his atomic theory to fully understand why he believed this and why it matters. Part 2. Atomic Physics and the Material Universe. To understand why Epicurus believed death is nothing to fear, why the gods cannot intervene in human affairs, and why pleasure is the only rational guide to life, we must first understand his physics. This is not incidental or optional. Epicurean ethics is built directly on Epicurean physics, and his physics was among the most sophisticated and radical scientific theories of the ancient world. Epicurus adopted and modified the atomic theory of Democritus, who had lived about a century earlier. But where Democritus was primarily interested in explaining natural phenomena, Epicurus was interested in liberation. His physics was explicitly designed to free human beings from superstition, from fear, from the belief that invisible powers controlled their destiny. The fundamental claim is this: everything that exists is made of atoms and void. Nothing else exists. Atoms are literally uncuttable, from the Greek atomos. They are the smallest possible units of matter, solid, eternal, indestructible, moving through infinite empty space. They vary in size and shape, with hooks and grooves and surfaces that allow them to combine in different configurations. Everything we see, feel, think and experience is the result of atoms colliding, combining and separating according to natural laws. This sounds simple, but the implications are staggering. If everything is atoms and void, then there is no room for supernatural forces. Gods, if they exist, must also be made of atoms. The soul or mind is not some immaterial essence, but a particularly fine configuration of atoms distributed throughout the body. When the body dies and dissolves, these soul atoms scatter, and consciousness ends. There is no afterlife, no judgment, no punishment or reward. But Epicurus faced a problem, one that troubled ancient atomism and would trouble materialist philosophy for centuries. If atoms fall through the void in straight lines due to their weight, And if the universe operates by deterministic laws, then everything is predetermined. There is no free will, no moral responsibility, no genuine choice. And if there is no choice, then Epicurus's entire ethical project collapses. You cannot tell someone to choose pleasure over pain if choice itself is an illusion. So Epicurus introduced one of the most controversial concepts in ancient philosophy, the swerve, or clinamen in Latin. At random, unpredictable moments, atoms swerve slightly from their downward path. Not by much, just the minimum possible deviation. But this tiny swerve breaks the chain of determinism. It allows for chance, for spontaneity, for the possibility that the future is not entirely determined by the past. This swerve has been ridiculed for 2,000 years. The Stoic philosophers mocked it as arbitrary and unscientific. Modern scholars have debated whether Epicurus was describing something like quantum indeterminacy, or simply making a desperate philosophical move to save free will. The Roman poet Lucretius, our best source for Epicurean physics, placed the swerve at the foundation of his epic poem On the Nature of Things, suggesting it was absolutely central to the system. But here is what makes the swerve philosophically interesting beyond the question of its scientific accuracy. Epicurus recognized that a purely deterministic universe is incompatible with ethics, with the idea that we are responsible for our choices and can shape our lives. Rather than abandon ethics or accept determinism, he modified his physics to accommodate human experience. This is philosophy in service of human flourishing, not pure theoretical consistency. The atomic theory also explains perception and knowledge. Objects constantly emit thin films of atoms, idola or simulacra, like layers of an onion peeling away. These atomic films travel through space and strike our sense organs, and this physical contact is what we experience as seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching. Even thoughts and dreams are caused by extremely fine atomic films penetrating our bodies and affecting the soul atoms. This means that all sensation is fundamentally reliable. Our senses cannot lie because they are just reporting physical contact with atomic films. When we make errors, it is not because our senses deceive us, but because we add judgment, opinion, or interpretation beyond what the senses actually report. If you see something that looks like a tower in the distance, your senses are accurately reporting the atomic film reaching your eyes. If you judge that it is definitely a tower, and then discover it is actually a large tree, the error is in your judgment, not your sensation. This has profound epistemological implications. It means that empirical observation is the foundation of all knowledge. We cannot trust abstract reasoning that contradicts sensory evidence. We cannot trust revelations or mystical insights that bypass the senses. Knowledge builds from the ground up, from repeated sensory contacts that form preconceptions or general concepts in the mind. The universe itself, according to Epicurus, is infinite in both space and atoms. It has no center, no edge, no beginning, and no end. Our world is just one of infinitely many worlds forming and dissolving throughout infinite space. Some worlds have life, some do not. Some have gods, though, as we discussed, these gods are perfect beings, living between worlds in a state of complete ataraxia, completely unconcerned with human affairs. This infinite, eternal, material universe operates entirely by natural law. Lightning is not Zeus's anger, but electrical discharge. Earthquakes are not Poseidon's rage, but underground movements. Disease is not divine punishment, but natural processes we can study and potentially control. Epicurus wrote an entire book on meteorology to provide natural explanations for atmospheric phenomena, explicitly to remove fear of the gods. But the most important application of Epicurean physics is to the nature of the self. You are a temporary configuration of atoms. The atoms that compose you have existed forever and will exist forever, but this particular arrangement, this specific pattern that is you, is finite and fragile. The soul atoms are held together by the container of the body. When the body breaks apart at death, the soul atoms scatter, and the pattern that was you ceases to exist. This is why death is nothing to us. There is no you after death to experience anything. The fear of death is therefore irrational, a confusion, a failure to understand the nature of the self. You cannot be harmed by non-existence because there is no you to be harmed. But notice something crucial here. This argument depends entirely on the truth of Epicurean physics. If the soul is immaterial, if consciousness can exist independently of the body, if there is an afterlife, then Epicurus's entire case collapses. His ethics is parasitic on his physics. This is both a strength, making it a unified and coherent system, and a vulnerability, making it dependent on claims about the physical world that might be false. Modern physics has validated some Epicurean insights and rejected others. Atoms exist, though they are not uncuttable. They can be split into subatomic particles. The idea of infinite space and multiple worlds or universes appears in modern cosmology. The notion that consciousness depends on physical processes in the brain is mainstream neuroscience. Quantum mechanics even includes genuine randomness, though not quite in the way Epicurus imagined the swerve. But Epicurus was wrong about many specifics. Atomic films do not explain perception, light and sound work differently than he thought. The soul is not a material substance of fine atoms, but an emergent property of neural activity. His astronomical theories were often incorrect. Yet the core insight remains powerful. If we are material beings in a material universe, if consciousness is a product of physical processes, then many traditional fears and hopes are indeed irrational. There is no cosmic judge, no ultimate purpose, no grand design. We are temporary patterns in an eternal flow of matter and energy. This is either terrifying or liberating, and Epicurus chose liberation. Part 3. The Science of Pleasure. Now we can dive deeper into what Epicurus meant by pleasure and how his hedonism actually works in practice. This is where his philosophy becomes most practical, most applicable, and also most controversial. First, we must understand that Epicurus was attempting something unprecedented, a scientific ethics. He wanted to ground moral philosophy not in divine command, not in abstract principles, not in social convention, but in observable facts about human nature. And the most obvious fact about human nature, the one everyone can verify through their own experience, is that we seek pleasure and avoid pain. Watch a newborn infant before any cultural conditioning. It cries to avoid pain and quiets when comfortable. Every animal, every sentient being operates by this basic program. Pleasure and pain are nature's signals, telling us what promotes our well-being and what threatens it. They are not arbitrary preferences, but fundamental features of conscious existence. This is why pleasure is the good, not because someone declared it so, but because it is the natural end toward which all creatures move. You cannot escape this. Even the ascetic who renounces physical pleasure does so because they believe it will bring them some greater pleasure or relief from disturbance, whether spiritual peace or divine reward or simple self-satisfaction. Pleasure is the criterion, the standard by which we measure everything else. But here is where Epicurus becomes sophisticated. Not all pleasures are equal, and not all pleasures are worth pursuing. This is what separates Epicurus from crude hedonism, from the caricature his critics created. He developed what we might call a hedonic calculus, a systematic method for evaluating pleasures and pains. The first distinction, as we discussed, is between kinetic and katastematic pleasures. But within these categories, Epicurus made further crucial distinctions about desires. Some desires are natural and necessary: hunger, thirst, shelter from cold, safety from danger. These must be satisfied for survival and for freedom from pain. Satisfying them brings both kinetic pleasure, the active enjoyment of eating or drinking, and katastematic pleasure, the state of not being hungry or thirsty. Other desires are natural but unnecessary: sexual pleasure, fine food, luxurious surroundings. These are grounded in nature. They are not artificial, but we can live well without satisfying them. They can enhance life if pursued wisely, but they become dangerous if we depend on them. The problem is not the pleasure itself, but the attachment, the need, the disturbance when we cannot get them. Then there are desires that are neither natural nor necessary: fame, political power, excessive wealth, victory over others. These are entirely artificial, created by society and sustained by opinion. They have no natural limit because they are comparative. They depend on having more than others. No amount of fame ever feels like enough because there is always someone more famous. No amount of power satisfies because power is inherently precarious and requires constant vigilance to maintain. This is one of Epicurus's most penetrating insights. Some desires are unlimited by nature, and unlimited desires guarantee unhappiness. If your happiness depends on becoming the richest person in the world, you will almost certainly fail and be miserable. But if your happiness depends on having enough food, water, shelter, safety and friends, these are achievable by nearly everyone. The wise person, the Epicurean sage, learns to distinguish between these types of desires and to minimize dependence on anything beyond the natural and necessary. This is not deprivation or asceticism. It is strategic minimalism, reducing vulnerability to fortune while maximizing stable pleasure. Consider a concrete example. Food. You need food to survive. That is natural and necessary. The pleasure of eating when hungry is intense and reliable. But if you become dependent on gourmet meals, on exotic ingredients, on specific restaurants or chefs, you have made yourself vulnerable. When you cannot access these luxuries, you suffer. Your baseline has been raised, and simple food no longer satisfies. The Epicurean cultivates the ability to enjoy simple food, to find pleasure in bread and water, so that anything beyond this is a bonus, not a necessity. This does not mean never enjoying fine food when available. It means not needing it, not depending on it, not suffering in its absence. The pleasure is the same, removal of hunger, but the wise person can achieve it with minimal resources. This principle applies to everything. The Epicurean lives simply not out of moral principle, but out of strategic wisdom. Simplicity is freedom. Every additional need is another potential source of disturbance, another vulnerability, another opportunity for pain. But Epicurus went further in analyzing pleasure. He recognized that we must calculate not just immediate pleasure and pain, but also consequences. Some pleasures lead to greater pains. The pleasure of drunkenness leads to hangover and potentially addiction. The pleasure of overeating leads to illness and obesity. The pleasure of casual sex might lead to jealousy, disease, unwanted pregnancy, or emotional turmoil. Conversely, some pains lead to greater pleasures. The pain of exercise leads to health and strength. The pain of studying leads to knowledge and capability. The pain of medical treatment leads to relief from disease. Therefore, the wise person sometimes chooses pain over pleasure, and sometimes forgoes pleasure to avoid pain. This is not contradiction, but sophisticated calculation. The goal is always maximum pleasure over a lifetime, maximum ataraxia, but achieving this requires foresight, discipline, and wisdom. This reveals something important. Epicureanism requires virtue. Not virtue as an end in itself, as the Stoics taught, but virtue as a means to pleasure. Courage, moderation, wisdom, justice, these are all necessary for achieving stable, lasting pleasure. The coward suffers constant fear. The intemperate person becomes enslaved to their appetites. The fool makes poor choices that lead to pain. The unjust person lives in fear of punishment and cannot have real friends. So virtue and pleasure are not opposed, they are aligned. This is a direct challenge to Plato and Aristotle, who both argued that virtue is valuable, independent of pleasure. Epicurus says no, virtue is instrumentally valuable. It is the method, the technique for achieving the good life, which is the pleasant life. Critics have attacked this relentlessly. They argue that it makes virtue purely selfish, that it reduces human motivation to simple pleasure-seeking, that it cannot account for genuine altruism or self-sacrifice. We will examine these criticisms in detail later, but for now, note that Epicurus has a response. Genuine friendship, which we will explore next, actually does involve concern for others, but it is concern that itself produces pleasure. The paradox is that the surest path to your own pleasure is through caring about others. The hedonic calculus also involves temporal considerations. Pleasures vary in intensity and duration. A brief, intense pleasure might be less valuable overall than a longer, mild pleasure. Epicurus argued that mental pleasures are superior to bodily pleasures, precisely because they have greater duration and stability. The body experiences only present pleasure and pain, but the mind can experience past and future through memory and anticipation. This means that a wise person can endure present bodily pain by recollecting past pleasures or anticipating future ones. Epicurus himself, dying in agony from kidney stones, wrote a letter saying that he was nevertheless happy because he was remembering pleasant philosophical conversations with friends. The mental pleasure outweighed the bodily pain. This also means that mental disturbances, anxieties, fears and regrets are actually worse than bodily pains because they are more persistent and harder to remedy. Anxiety about the future can poison every moment. Regret about the past can last a lifetime. This is why Epicurean therapy focuses so heavily on correcting false beliefs that cause mental disturbance. The ultimate goal, remember, is ataraxia, a stable, lasting state of tranquility. This is not ecstasy, not intense joy, not euphoria. It is more like contentment, serenity, peace of mind. It is the state of having no unfulfilled natural and necessary desires, no false beliefs causing fear or anxiety, no dependence on things outside your control. In this state, you are maximally pleased because you are experiencing the absence of all pain and disturbance. And according to Epicurus, this pleasure cannot be increased, only varied. You might add variety through conversation, learning, aesthetic experience, but the fundamental level of pleasure is already maximal. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive claim in all of Epicureanism. It goes against every instinct of consumer capitalism, every message telling us that more is better, that happiness scales with acquisition. Epicurus says there is a ceiling to pleasure, and it is surprisingly low, surprisingly accessible. The good life does not require winning the lottery or becoming famous or achieving great success. It requires only meeting basic needs and cultivating mental tranquility. Whether this is true depends partly on empirical questions about human psychology and partly on how we define and measure pleasure. Modern hedonic psychology and research on life satisfaction produces mixed evidence. Beyond a certain income level, additional wealth produces little additional happiness, which supports Epicurus. But people do seem to adapt to both good and bad circumstances, suggesting that lasting contentment might be more difficult to achieve than Epicurus suggested. The deeper question is whether tranquility is really the highest human good, or whether humans also need challenge, growth, achievement, and meaningful struggle. This is where many modern critics part ways with Epicurus, arguing that his vision of the good life is too passive, too focused on avoiding pain rather than accomplishing great things. Part 4. The Tetrapharmakos. The Tetrapharmakos, meaning fourfold remedy, is perhaps the most elegant summary of Epicurean philosophy. These 4 maxims, attributed to Epicurus's student Philodemus, encapsulate the therapeutic core of the system. They are designed to be memorized, repeated, internalized, used as mental tools for achieving and maintaining ataraxia. The 4 remedies are: do not fear God, do not worry about death. What is good is easy to get. What is terrible is easy to endure. Each of these addresses a fundamental source of human anxiety, and together they constitute a complete program for mental peace. Let us examine each in depth. First, do not fear God. We have already explored Epicurus's theology, but it is worth emphasizing why this was so central to his therapeutic program. In the ancient world, religion was not primarily about personal belief or morality, but about managing the gods through ritual, sacrifice, and proper behavior. People lived in constant anxiety about offending divine powers, about failing to perform the right ceremonies, about natural disasters as signs of divine anger. Epicurus said, "This is all unnecessary suffering. The gods, if they exist, are perfect beings who need nothing and care about nothing outside their own perfect happiness. They do not create the world, they do not sustain it, they do not interfere with it. They cannot be bribed with sacrifice or flattered with prayer. They do not punish wrongdoing or reward virtue. They are simply models of what perfect tranquility looks like, beings to contemplate and admire, not to fear or worship." This was spiritually revolutionary. It removed an entire category of anxiety from human life. You do not need to worry about whether you have performed the right rituals, or pleased the right gods, or avoided divine offence. Natural disasters are just physical events, not judgments. Success and failure in life are not rewards or punishments, but natural consequences and chance. But notice what Epicurus did not do. He did not simply declare that gods do not exist. That would have been dangerous legally. Athens had executed Socrates partly for impiety, but more importantly, it would have been unpersuasive. People believe in gods because they have experiences that seem to confirm their existence, because they have received cultural conditioning, because they find meaning in religious practice. Instead, Epicurus offered a reinterpretation. Gods exist, but they are not what people think they are. The popular conception of gods as powerful beings who care about humans is a projection of human psychology, an anthropomorphization. Real gods, truly perfect beings, would be nothing like this. So you can keep the concept of divinity while removing the fear, anxiety and manipulation that comes with conventional religion. This is sophisticated philosophical therapy. It works with existing beliefs, modifying them gradually rather than demanding immediate rejection. It provides a rational alternative that satisfies intellectual curiosity while removing emotional disturbance. Second remedy: do not worry about death. This is perhaps the most famous Epicurean argument, but it is also the most debated and criticized. We have already explored the basic logic. Death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. We never actually encounter our own death. But let us examine this more carefully, because the argument has several layers. First, Epicurus is attacking the fear of death as a state, the fear of being dead. This fear assumes that you will somehow experience being dead, that you will be conscious of your non-existence, that there will be a you to suffer the absence of life. But this is incoherent. Death is the end of experience, the end of consciousness, the end of you. There is literally nothing to fear because there is no subject left to experience anything. Consider the time before you were born. Were you harmed by not existing for billions of years before your birth? Did you suffer during the Jurassic period because you were not alive to see the dinosaurs? Of course not. Non-existence before birth was not bad for you, and non-existence after death will also not be bad for you. They are symmetrical. This argument, often called the symmetry argument, is elegant but has been challenged. Critics point out that there seems to be an asymmetry in our attitudes toward prenatal and post-mortem non-existence. Most people do not regret not being born earlier, but do regret that they will die and not experience the future. This suggests that our concern about death is not simply about non-existence itself, but about the loss of possible future goods, the deprivation of experiences we would have had if we lived longer. Epicurus has a response to this, though it is not entirely satisfying to everyone. If you are dead, there is no you to be deprived of anything. Deprivation requires a subject who lacks something they would otherwise have. But in death there is no subject. You cannot be harmed by missing out on future experiences because there is no you to miss out. The debate here gets philosophically intricate. Is harm only possible if the subject currently exists and experiences the harm? Or can you be harmed by things that affect you even when you are not experiencing them? Can posthumous harms exist? If someone defames your reputation after you die, have you been harmed? Epicurus would say no, because you do not exist to be harmed. But many people find this counterintuitive. There is also the process of dying to consider, distinct from the state of being dead. Dying can involve pain, fear, loss of control, degradation. Epicurus acknowledges this, but argues that his philosophy can help here too. If you understand that death itself is nothing to fear, that there is no judgment or punishment or consciousness after death, then the dying process becomes less terrifying. It is just a transition from existence to non-existence, not a journey to some unknown destination. Moreover, the Epicurean life, focused on simple pleasures and mental tranquility, prepares you for death. If your happiness depends on wealth, power, or achievements, death means losing everything that matters to you. But if your happiness comes from friendship, simple pleasures, and peace of mind, then you have lived fully already. Death takes nothing essential away. Epicurus himself demonstrated this. According to Diogenes Laertius, Epicurus died at age 72 from kidney stones after 14 days of excruciating pain. But he wrote a final letter to his friend Idomeneus, saying that even though his body was racked with pain, his mind remained joyful through recollection of their philosophical conversations. This was not stoic endurance through dutiful acceptance, but Epicurean pleasure through mental focus. Third remedy: what is good is easy to get. This follows directly from the analysis of desire we discussed earlier. If the good life is defined by maximizing pleasure through satisfying natural and necessary desires while maintaining ataraxia, then the good life is accessible to nearly everyone. You need food, but not gourmet food. You need water, but not imported mineral water. You need shelter, but not a mansion. You need safety, but not absolute security. You need friends, and friendship is free. You need to learn philosophy to correct false beliefs, and philosophy is free, or at least very cheap. This is radically egalitarian. The good life is not reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, the educated elite. A poor person can live well, a slave can live well if they achieve mental freedom. A woman in a patriarchal society can live well, a barbarian outside Greek civilization can live well. All that matters is understanding the philosophy and living by it. Compare this to Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle said that the good life, eudaimonia or flourishing, requires external goods: wealth, health, good birth, friends, political engagement, leisure for contemplation. A slave cannot flourish. A poor person cannot fully flourish. A woman cannot engage in politics and therefore cannot fully flourish. The good life is inherently aristocratic. Epicurus democratized ethics. He said, no, happiness does not require these external goods. Yes, some are helpful, but they are not necessary. The core of the good life, ataraxia through understanding and right desire, is available to everyone regardless of circumstances. This had enormous appeal in the Hellenistic world, a world of constant warfare, political instability, and social upheaval. Traditional city-state structures were collapsing. People felt powerless in the face of vast empires and historical forces. Epicureanism offered a way to achieve happiness regardless of external circumstances, a kind of internal fortress of tranquility. But critics point out a problem. This radical independence from external goods is only possible if you truly believe Epicurean principles and have truly cultivated the right mental habits. But that requires education, leisure to study philosophy, intellectual capacity, and a supportive community. These are not equally available to everyone. A slave working 16 hours a day in a mine cannot easily study philosophy or cultivate ataraxia. A person in chronic pain or severe poverty or constant danger faces obstacles to tranquility that Epicurus underestimates. There is also the question of whether simple pleasures really are as satisfying as Epicurus claims once you have experienced more complex ones. Can you really be as happy with bread and water as with fine cuisine once you know what fine cuisine tastes like? This is the problem of adaptation and habituation. Epicurus says yes if you cultivate the right mental attitude. But modern research on hedonic adaptation is more ambiguous. Fourth remedy. What is terrible is easy to endure. This addresses pain, both physical and mental. Epicurus argued that severe pains are usually brief and chronic pains are usually mild. If pain is so intense that it is genuinely unbearable, you will either recover quickly or die quickly, ending the pain. If pain continues for a long time, it must be mild enough to endure, otherwise it would kill you. Furthermore, mental pleasures can outweigh physical pains, as Epicurus demonstrated in his own death. By focusing on pleasant memories, philosophical insights, friendship, and intellectual contemplation, you can maintain ataraxia even while experiencing bodily distress. This is obviously the most controversial and weakest of the four remedies. It simply is not true that all severe pains are brief. Chronic conditions can involve significant sustained pain that is neither mild nor quickly fatal. Kidney stones, migraines, nerve damage, arthritis, cancer, these can involve long-term severe pain. Modern medicine has made this even more obvious. We can keep people alive much longer while suffering. Epicurus lacked our medical knowledge, but his claim seems empirically false even in the ancient world. There were clearly people suffering from chronic severe pain who neither recovered quickly nor died quickly. The stronger Epicurean argument is about mental pain and disturbance. Most of what we experience as suffering is mental. anxiety about the future, regret about the past, fear, shame, jealousy, anger. These mental disturbances are not inevitable. They arise from false beliefs and can be cured through philosophy. This is the core of Epicurean therapy, correcting the beliefs that cause unnecessary suffering. If you stop fearing death, stop fearing the gods, stop chasing unlimited desires, stop comparing yourself to others, stop worrying about things outside your control, you remove most sources of mental disturbance. What remains, bodily pain and natural grief, is genuinely unavoidable, but limited in scope. The Tetrapharmakos functions as a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy avant la lettre. It identifies irrational beliefs causing distress, provides rational alternatives, and encourages repeated practice to internalize new thought patterns. Modern cognitive therapy uses remarkably similar techniques, identifying cognitive distortions, challenging irrational thoughts, replacing them with more realistic and helpful beliefs. The key insight is that much suffering is optional, caused not by external circumstances, but by how we interpret and respond to those circumstances. This does not mean all suffering is optional, or that we can think our way out of any problem. But it means that we have more control over our mental state than we typically realize, and cultivating that control is the path to tranquility. Part 5. Friendship as the highest good. Of all pleasures, wisdom proclaims friendship the greatest, the most important, the most necessary for the good life. This is Epicurus's teaching, and it is perhaps his most beautiful and most paradoxical claim. Paradoxical because Epicureanism is based on the principle that pleasure is the only good, and that we act rationally only when pursuing our own pleasure. This sounds fundamentally selfish, egoistic, unable to account for genuine care for others. Yet Epicurus placed friendship at the absolute centre of his philosophy, calling it security, the foundation of confidence, pleasure, and the thing without which life is not worth living. How does he reconcile these apparently contradictory commitments? First, we must understand that Epicurean friendship is not casual acquaintance or mere social connection. It is philia, the deep bond between people who know each other intimately, trust each other completely, and find their lives enhanced by each other's presence. This is the relationship between members of the garden, people who have chosen to live together, study together, pursue philosophy together. The garden itself was structured around friendship. Unlike Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, which were formal educational institutions, the garden was intentionally domestic, familial, communal. Members shared meals, shared resources, lived together in an extended household. The philosophical discussions were embedded in daily life, not separated into formal lectures. This was radical in several ways. It included women as full philosophical participants, not just as wives or daughters, but as students and teachers. Themista, Leontian, and Nicidian were prominent members. It included slaves, or former slaves, like Epicurus's own slave Mies, whom he freed. It welcomed foreigners and anyone regardless of social class. The only requirement was commitment to the philosophy and to the community. Why was friendship so central? Several interconnected reasons. First, friendship provides security, one of the natural and necessary goods. In the ancient world, without modern states or police or social safety nets, you depended on your family and friends for survival. Friends help when you're sick, protect you from enemies, share resources in times of need, provide housing if you lose your home. This is not abstract, it is life and death. But Epicurus went beyond instrumental friendship, beyond friends as useful allies. True friends care about each other for their own sake, not just as means to security or pleasure. Yet somehow this non-instrumental care is itself the source of the greatest pleasure. How can this be? This is where Epicurean psychology becomes subtle. When you care deeply about a friend, their happiness becomes a source of your happiness. You take pleasure in their pleasure, you suffer when they suffer, your interests become intertwined. This is not calculation or strategy, it is a natural psychological development. The more you interact with someone in trust and affection, the more your emotional life becomes connected to theirs. So, while friendship begins perhaps from self-interest, from the desire for security and pleasant company, it develops into something that transcends simple egoism. You come to genuinely care about your friend's welfare as an end in itself. Yet this very caring is pleasurable for you. There is no contradiction. Pleasure and altruism can coincide. Epicurus wrote that the wise person will even die for a friend under the right circumstances. This seems incompatible with pleasure-seeking. How can dying, ending all possibility of pleasure, be the rational choice for a hedonist? But if your friend's happiness has become essential to your own happiness, if living with the knowledge that you betrayed your friend would make continued life unbearable, then dying to save them might genuinely be the choice that maximizes your overall well-being. Not because of duty or virtue for its own sake, but because of the deep psychological integration that true friendship creates. This is philosophically controversial. Critics argue that Epicurus is smuggling in non-hedonistic values, that genuine friendship cannot be reduced to pleasure-seeking, even enlightened pleasure-seeking. When you die for your friend, you do not experience any pleasure from their survival because you are dead. So the action cannot be explained by pleasure maximization. Defenders of Epicurus respond in several ways. One response is that the decision to sacrifice yourself is made while you are still alive, and can imagine the pleasure of knowing your friend will survive. Another is that dying with the knowledge that you betrayed your friend would be so painful that death itself is preferable. A third is that we should not expect perfect consistency, that Epicurus is acknowledging the reality of human psychology even when it complicates his theoretical framework. The archaeological evidence from Herculaneum, where a library of Epicurean texts survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, shows extensive writing about friendship. Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher from the 1st century BCE, wrote entire treatises on friends and friendship, analyzing different types of friendship, how to cultivate them, how to resolve conflicts, how to maintain them over distance and time. These texts reveal sophisticated thinking about emotional bonds, trust, vulnerability, and reciprocity. They discuss how to recognize true friends versus flatterers or opportunists. They analyze the pleasure of frank speech, parrhesia, the ability to speak openly and honestly with friends without fear of judgment or betrayal. They explore how friends should correct each other's errors, offer advice, provide support during illness or grief. Friendship, in the Epicurean sense, requires several conditions. First, shared values and understanding. You cannot be deep friends with someone who fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the good life. Second, trust built over time through consistent behavior, not immediate intimacy, but gradually deepening connection. Third, mutual benefit, not exploitation, but genuine reciprocity where both people's lives are enriched. Fourth, time spent together in pleasant activities, especially philosophical discussion, shared meals, conversation. The emphasis on pleasure in friendship is important to understand correctly. It does not mean that friends only interact when it is fun or easy. Real friendship involves supporting each other through difficulty, illness, grief, failure. But the overall trajectory of the friendship should be pleasure-enhancing for both people. A relationship that is chronically draining, toxic or distressing is not true friendship and should be ended. This raises difficult questions about unconditional commitment. Is Epicurean friendship ultimately conditional on continued pleasure? If your friend becomes chronically depressed or seriously ill and is no longer pleasant company, do you abandon them? Epicurus would say no, because abandoning a friend in need would destroy your own ataraxia through guilt and would undermine the trust necessary for all your friendships. But the justification remains instrumental, rooted in your own well-being rather than duty to the friend. Modern psychology largely validates Epicurus's emphasis on friendship for well-being. Study after study shows that close relationships are among the strongest predictors of life satisfaction, mental health, and even physical health and longevity. People with strong friendships are happier, healthier, and live longer than isolated individuals. The quality of relationships matters more than wealth, fame, or achievement for subjective well-being. The Epicurean community model also anticipates modern intentional communities, co-housing, and friendship-based households. Many people today are experimenting with living arrangements centered on chosen family rather than biological family, shared values rather than economic necessity. The loneliness epidemic in modern societies suggests that Epicurus was right about the fundamental importance of close relationships. But there are also complications the ancient world did not face. Modern mobility means friendships must often be maintained across distance. Technology provides tools for connection, but also creates shallow social networks that feel like friendship but lack depth. The time required to build and maintain deep friendships competes with work demands, family obligations, and endless entertainment options. The Epicurean answer would be clear: prioritize friendship above almost everything else. Structure your life to allow for regular deep connection with a small group of close friends. This might mean living near friends, working less, owning less, simplifying life to create time and energy for relationships. The garden model, people living together in a philosophical community, remains attractive to many who feel isolated in modern individualistic societies. Part 6. Justice, Society, and the Social Contract. Epicurus's political philosophy is less developed and less famous than his ethics, but it contains radical insights and controversial implications. The core question is, if pleasure is the only good and each person rationally pursues their own pleasure, how can we have a functioning society? Why should anyone obey laws, respect others' rights, or contribute to the common good? The Epicurean answer is the social contract, one of the earliest clear formulations of this idea in Western philosophy. Justice is not natural, not divinely ordained, not based on abstract moral truths. It is a human invention, a mutually beneficial agreement to not harm each other and to cooperate for common advantage. Epicurus wrote, "Justice is not something in itself, but in our mutual dealings, a kind of compact to not harm or be harmed." This appears in the principal doctrines as maxims 31 through 38, a systematic account of justice as convention. The argument goes like this. In a state of nature without laws or social cooperation, everyone would constantly fear being harmed by others. The strong would dominate the weak. No one could accumulate property without losing it to theft. No one could trust anyone. Life would be, as Hobbes would later write, nasty, brutish, and short. This state of constant fear and insecurity is incompatible with ataraxia. Rational individuals therefore agree to a compact. I will not harm you if you do not harm me. I will respect your property if you respect mine. We will create rules and consequences for breaking them to make this agreement stable and enforceable. These rules are what we call justice or law. Notice what this implies. Justice is relative to time, place, and circumstance. What counts as just depends on what people have agreed to, explicitly or implicitly, in their particular society. Different societies might have different laws based on different circumstances, and that is perfectly appropriate as long as the laws serve the purpose of mutual advantage. There is no cosmic justice, no natural law written into the fabric of reality, no divine command. Justice is purely human, purely practical, purely instrumental. It is valuable because it produces security, which is necessary for ataraxia, but it has no value in itself. This has radical implications that made Epicureanism politically dangerous. If justice is just social convention, then religious law has no special authority. If justice varies by society, then Greek law is not superior to barbarian law simply because it is Greek. If justice exists only for mutual advantage, then laws that do not serve this purpose are not truly just and need not be obeyed. But Epicurus was careful here. He did not advocate revolution or law-breaking. In fact, he advised staying out of politics altogether. "Live unknown, laeth biosas," was one of his famous sayings. Political engagement brings disturbance, danger, competition, stress, all incompatible with ataraxia. The wise person obeys the law not because it is inherently right, but because disobedience brings punishment and anxiety about punishment. Even unjust laws should generally be obeyed because the disturbance of law-breaking exceeds any benefit. You cannot achieve tranquility if you're constantly looking over your shoulder, fearing arrest or retaliation. The only exception might be if a law is so oppressive that obedience itself destroys ataraxia. But even then, Epicurus would probably recommend withdrawal rather than resistance. This political quietism was controversial in ancient Athens, where active citizenship was considered essential to the good life. Aristotle had argued that humans are political animals, that we achieve our full humanity only through participation in the polis. The Stoics later argued that we have duties to the broader human community, that we are all citizens of the cosmopolis, the universal city. Epicurus said no. Humans are not naturally political, and political engagement is generally harmful to individual happiness. The best life is lived in small communities of friends, gardens, not cities, focused on philosophy and simple pleasures rather than public affairs. This raises difficult moral questions. What about injustice? If you see someone being oppressed, harmed, exploited, do you have any obligation to intervene? The Epicurean answer seems to be only if intervention serves your own interest, either because the victim is your friend or because you fear that allowing injustice will undermine social stability and eventually threaten you. This appears morally deficient to many critics. It seems to make morality purely selfish, to eliminate genuine duty or obligation to strangers, to justify indifference to suffering as long as you are personally safe. It cannot explain why anyone should oppose slavery, tyranny, or systematic oppression unless they personally benefit from doing so. Epicureans have several responses. First, remember that friendship is central to the philosophy, and friends do have obligations to each other beyond narrow self-interest. If you extend the concept of friendship broadly to see all humans as potential friends, or at least as beings whose suffering affects you empathetically, then you have reason to care about justice beyond your immediate circle. Second, social instability harms everyone. If you allow gross injustice, you create resentment, rebellion, violence that disrupts peace for everyone, including you. Enlightened self-interest, therefore, supports basic justice and fairness, even for strangers. Third, humans naturally feel empathy and sympathy for others' suffering. This is a psychological fact, not a moral principle. Witnessing suffering causes you distress. Helping others produces pleasure through relief of that distress and satisfaction of natural social emotions. So, even without moral duty, you have psychological motivation to care about others' welfare. But critics remain unsatisfied. This still seems to ground all morality in self-interest, even if enlightened and psychologically sophisticated self-interest. It cannot explain genuine altruism, the willingness to sacrifice your own good for others' benefit even when no one will know and you will not benefit psychologically. The deeper question is whether Epicurus can account for moral reasons that are not reducible to reasons of pleasure or self-interest. Can we say that slavery is wrong not just because it produces bad consequences, but because it violates human dignity? Can we say that we have duties to future generations, not just because thinking about them makes us happy, but because they have legitimate claims on us? Can we say that justice has intrinsic value apart from its utility? Strict Epicureanism seems to require answering no to all these questions. But many modern Epicureans are uncomfortable with these implications and try to expand or modify the theory to accommodate stronger moral commitments. One interesting aspect of Epicurean justice is its handling of punishment. Since justice is for mutual advantage, punishment is justified only when it serves the purpose of deterrence or prevention, not for retribution or making the offender pay for wrongdoing. If someone has violated the social contract, you punish them to deter them and others from future violations, to incapacitate dangerous individuals, perhaps to reform them. But revenge, making someone suffer because they deserve it, has no justification. This is remarkably modern. Most contemporary theories of criminal justice reject purely retributive approaches in favour of consequentialist justifications focused on deterrence, incapacitation and rehabilitation. Epicurus anticipated this by 2,000 years. The social contract theory also influenced later philosophers directly. Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century all developed social contract theories that owed debts to Epicurus even when they disagreed with his hedonism. The idea that political authority derives from consent, that laws exist for mutual benefit rather than divine ordination, that justice is conventional rather than natural, these became foundational to liberal political philosophy. But there is a tension in Epicureanism between the individualism of the ethics and the collectivism required for society to function. If everyone truly lives for ataraxia and withdrawal from public life, who maintains the social institutions that make private tranquility possible? Who defends against foreign invasion? Who administers justice? Who builds infrastructure? The Epicurean answer seems to be, we do the minimum necessary to maintain basic security, but no more. We cooperate in limited ways for mutual advantage, but we do not sacrifice personal tranquility for grand collective projects. This works if most people are not Epicureans, if there are enough traditionally ambitious people who seek power and glory to keep society running. But if everyone became Epicurean, society might collapse from lack of willing participants in governance and defence. This is sometimes called the free rider problem of Epicureanism. The Epicurean life depends on social infrastructure and security provided by others' efforts. But Epicureans themselves minimize contribution to these collective goods. They benefit from others' sacrifices while refusing to make comparable sacrifices themselves. Epicurus might respond that this criticism assumes society needs ambitious leaders and massive collective projects, but maybe it does not. Maybe small-scale voluntary cooperation is sufficient. Maybe the problems we think require government intervention are actually caused by government intervention. This anticipates anarchist and libertarian critiques of state power, though Epicurus was not systematic about political theory. Part 7. The Canon. Epistemology, the theory of knowledge, is usually not the most exciting part of philosophy. But for Epicurus, understanding how we know what we know was absolutely essential to the therapeutic project. If you cannot reliably distinguish truth from falsehood, you cannot correct the false beliefs that cause anxiety and prevent ataraxia. You need a method, a canon or measuring stick, for evaluating claims about reality. Epicurus identified 3 criteria of truth: sensations, preconceptions, and feelings. Each plays a distinct role in building reliable knowledge from the ground up. First, sensations. These are immediate, direct contacts between the sense organs and the world. When light enters your eye, sound enters your ear, molecules touch your tongue or nose or skin, you have a sensation. These sensations are always true because they are just registering physical impacts. The eye does not lie. The ear does not deceive. They report exactly what stimuli are affecting them. This sounds strange because obviously the senses make mistakes. You see a stick in water that appears bent but is actually straight. You hear a voice and think someone is calling you, but no one is there. You taste something and cannot identify what it is. How can the senses always be true if they produce these errors? Epicurus's answer is subtle. The error is not in the sensation, but in the judgment you add to the sensation. Your eyes accurately report the pattern of light entering them, which happens to be the pattern produced by a straight stick in water, which looks bent due to refraction. Your eyes are reporting correctly. The error occurs when you judge there is a bent stick, rather than there is a visual appearance of a bent stick. This distinction between sensation and judgment is crucial for the entire epistemology. Sensations are passive, automatic, non-conceptual registrations of physical impacts. They cannot be wrong because they are not making claims. They are just happening. Judgments are active interpretations that go beyond the immediate sensation, adding concepts, inferences, expectations. These judgments can be false because they involve reasoning that might be invalid or based on false preconceptions. So, the first rule of Epicurean epistemology is, trust your senses, but be careful about the judgments you make based on sensations. Always check whether you are reporting what you actually sensed or adding interpretation. Second criterion, preconceptions or prolepsis in Greek. These are general concepts formed in the mind through repeated exposure to similar sensations. The first time you see a horse, you have particular sensations of colour, shape, movement, sound. The second time you see a different horse, you have different but similar sensations. After many experiences of horses, your mind naturally forms a general concept, horse, that captures what all these individual experiences have in common. Preconceptions are essential for thinking and communication. Without general concepts, you could not recognize new instances of familiar things, could not use language meaningfully, could not reason about categories. When I say horse, we both access the same preconception formed through similar past experiences, allowing us to understand each other. Preconceptions are reliable as long as they are properly formed from sufficient sensory experience. They can be checked against new sensations. If you think you see a horse, but on closer inspection the sensations do not match your horse preconception, you revise your judgment. Problems arise when people form preconceptions based on insufficient experience, false testimony, or social conditioning rather than direct observation. Someone might form a preconception of God as an angry father figure based on religious teaching rather than experience. This preconception is unreliable and needs to be corrected by examining what actual experiences, if any, justify such a concept. Third criterion, feelings or emotions, specifically pleasure and pain. These are immediate bodily responses that tell us what promotes or harms our well-being. They are part of our natural equipment like sensations, and they provide guidance about how to act. Pleasure indicates that something is good for us. Pain indicates that something is bad for us. This does not mean that every pleasure should be pursued or every pain avoided. Remember the hedonic calculus. But feelings are the starting point, the basic data about value. We calculate consequences and make sophisticated judgments, but the ultimate standard is still the feeling of pleasure and pain, not abstract principles. These three criteria work together. You observe the world through sensations, form general concepts through preconceptions, and evaluate what matters through feelings. All knowledge builds up from these foundations without requiring any innate ideas, divine revelation, or purely rational intuition. This is radical empiricism, one of the earliest systematic articulations of this approach. Epicurus rejected Platonic forms, rejected innate knowledge, rejected mysticism and prophecy. Everything we know comes ultimately from experience, and any claim that cannot be traced back to sensory evidence is suspect. But Epicurus was not a naive empiricist. He recognized that we cannot directly observe everything. We cannot see atoms, we cannot observe distant places or past events, we cannot experiment with everything directly. So we need methods for extending knowledge beyond immediate observation. He used analogical reasoning and inference to the best explanation. We observe that visible things are made of smaller parts, so we infer that all matter is made of smallest parts, even if we cannot see them. We observe that similar causes produce similar effects, so we infer that distant phenomena we cannot directly study probably have causes similar to nearby phenomena we can study. The key principle is, any explanation that contradicts sensory evidence must be false, but among explanations compatible with evidence, we should prefer simpler, more natural ones over complex supernatural ones. If you can explain thunder as atmospheric discharge, or as Zeus's anger, both are compatible with the evidence of seeing lightning and hearing thunder. But the natural explanation is simpler and does not require positing invisible gods. This methodological naturalism was revolutionary. It systematically excluded supernatural explanations, not by proving them false, but by showing they are unnecessary and overly complex. This is essentially Occam's razor before Occam, the principle that we should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Epicurus also anticipated the scientific method's emphasis on multiple hypotheses. For phenomena we cannot directly observe or test, we should sometimes accept multiple possible explanations rather than committing to one. If several natural explanations are consistent with the evidence, and we have no way to decisively test between them, intellectual honesty requires admitting uncertainty. For example, what causes eclipses? Epicurus suggested several possible mechanisms, all natural, without insisting on one correct answer. The important thing was to eliminate fear-inducing supernatural explanations, not to have perfect scientific knowledge. This pragmatic approach to science is quite different from modern science's emphasis on finding the single true explanation, but it served Epicurus's therapeutic purpose. The Canon was preserved in Diogenes Laertius and in fragments, but we lost Epicurus's full systematic treatment. This makes it difficult to evaluate how sophisticated his epistemology really was. Modern philosophers have debated whether he adequately addressed skeptical challenges, whether his trust in sensation is justified, whether he can distinguish veridical from non-veridical experiences. The main criticism is that Epicurus seems to beg the question against skepticism. He assumes our senses are reliable and builds his epistemology on that assumption. But skeptics question precisely that assumption. How do you prove senses are reliable without already assuming they are? This is the problem of the criterion that skeptics like Sextus Empiricus pressed against dogmatic philosophers. Epicurus might respond that we have no choice but to start with sensation. It is the only access we have to the world beyond our own minds. Radical skepticism is self-defeating because skeptics must use their senses even to doubt their senses. So, we should provisionally accept sensory evidence as our starting point, while remaining open to revising specific judgments when evidence conflicts. This is basically the pragmatist response to skepticism. We cannot prove foundational assumptions with certainty, but we can and must use them provisionally because they work in practice. This makes Epicurus a kind of proto-pragmatist, 2,000 years before William James and John Dewey. The therapeutic application of Epicurean epistemology is clear throughout. Most false beliefs that cause anxiety cannot withstand careful examination. Fear of gods punishing you after death. What sensory evidence supports this? None. It is based on stories and authority, not observation. Fear that you need wealth and power to be happy. Check this against your actual experience of simple pleasures. You will find it is false. The Epicurean student is taught to constantly examine beliefs, trace them back to their evidential sources, eliminate those based on mere opinion or social pressure, retain only those grounded in sensation, preconception, and feeling. This critical examination is itself a practice, a discipline, something you do repeatedly like meditation or prayer in other traditions. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy uses similar techniques, examining the evidence for and against anxiety-producing thoughts, testing beliefs against reality, replacing distorted thinking with more accurate assessments. Epicurus was doing cognitive therapy with ancient tools. Part 8. Confronting Mortality. We return now to death, but with deeper understanding of why Epicurus devoted so much attention to this single fear. Death anxiety is not just one problem among many. It is the master fear that generates countless other disturbances. If you fear death, you fear vulnerability, loss, time passing, aging, illness, accidents, violence. You rush through life trying to accomplish everything before time runs out. You cling desperately to what you have, knowing it is temporary. You cannot be fully present because you are haunted by future absence. Epicurus recognized that eliminating death fear would revolutionize human existence. It would not make you immortal, but it would make your mortal life infinitely richer. You could live in the present without the shadow of non-existence poisoning every moment. You could appreciate what you have without frantic grasping. You could accept loss as natural rather than as cosmic injustice. So let us examine his arguments more carefully, including the powerful criticisms they have faced. The core argument we have discussed: death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. We never encounter our own death, so there is nothing to fear. This assumes that harm requires a subject who experiences the harm, and in death there is no subject. But Epicurus offered additional supporting arguments. One is the argument from time. The soul is a bodily organ made of particularly fine, mobile atoms distributed throughout the body. These soul atoms depend on the container of the body to hold them together. When the body dissolves at death, the soul atoms scatter immediately into the surrounding air. There is no gradual process, no lingering consciousness, no awareness of dying. One moment you exist, the next moment there is no you. It is instantaneous transition from being to non-being. This is meant to be comforting. You do not experience death. You do not experience the process of dissolving. You do not fade away, conscious of your own ending. You are simply here, then not here, with no intermediate state of awareness. Another argument addresses the concern about life being too short. Epicurus says that life does not need to be long to be complete. If you have achieved ataraxia, you have experienced the maximum pleasure possible. More years would not increase that pleasure, only vary it. Think of it like a play. A good play does not need to run forever to be satisfying. It has a natural length determined by its content, and extending it arbitrarily would not improve it. This is psychologically interesting, but philosophically controversial. Many people feel that life is valuable independent of pleasure, that there are projects worth completing, relationships worth continuing, experiences worth having, even if they do not maximize tranquility. A life cut short at age 20 might contain ataraxia, but still seems tragically incomplete compared to a life of 80 years. Epicurus has a response. That feeling of incompleteness comes from having unlimited desires, from thinking there is always more to accomplish, more to experience, more to achieve. But if you cultivate natural and necessary desires only, and if you achieve ataraxia, you have accomplished everything truly valuable. The rest is just variation, not addition. Still, many find this unconvincing. It seems to make life instrumentally valuable, just a vehicle for pleasure, rather than intrinsically valuable. It cannot explain why we care about things continuing after our death, our children's welfare, humanity's future, ongoing projects, our legacy. Another Epicurean argument addresses the fear that death might not be the end, that there might be an afterlife with judgment and punishment. Epicurus says this is logically impossible given materialism. If the soul is material, it dissolves with the body. There cannot be consciousness without the physical structure that produces it. So afterlife beliefs are not just unproven, but incoherent, given what we know about the nature of consciousness. But this obviously depends entirely on materialism being true. If consciousness is somehow non-material, if there is something immaterial about the self that survives bodily death, then Epicurus's entire argument collapses. He was aware of this, which is why so much of his physics is devoted to proving materialism and refuting dualistic conceptions of the soul. Modern neuroscience strongly supports the Epicurean view that consciousness is a product of physical brain processes. Damage to specific brain regions produces specific changes in consciousness, personality, memory, emotion. Altering brain chemistry through drugs or disease alters mental states. The tight correlation between brain and mind suggests they are not separate substances, but different ways of describing the same physical process. When the brain dies, neural activity stops and consciousness ends. There is no empirical evidence for any consciousness existing independently of functioning brains. Near-death experiences can be explained by oxygen deprivation and neurochemical changes in dying brains. No one has ever demonstrated consciousness surviving clinical death. So, empirically, Epicurus seems vindicated. Death is almost certainly the end of consciousness. But does this mean death is nothing to fear? Here is where the most powerful criticism emerges, often called the deprivation argument. Thomas Nagel articulated this most clearly in his essay Death in 1970. The badness of death, Nagel argues, is not experiential but comparative. Death is bad not because dying hurts, but because it deprives you of the goods you would have experienced if you had continued living. Consider a person killed at age 30 who would have lived happily to age 80 if not killed. That person has been deprived of 50 years of good experiences. This is a harm, even though the person does not experience the deprivation, because it makes their life worse than it would have been otherwise. We can be harmed by counterfactual comparisons. You are worse off than you would have been in an alternative scenario, even if you do not experience being worse off. Epicurus might respond, "Who is harmed?" At the moment of death, the person ceases to exist. There is no subject who possesses the property of being deprived. Deprivation requires a subject who is deprived, but in death there is no subject. You cannot be made worse off if there is no you. But critics press further. The harm occurs to the living person at the moment of death by depriving them of future life. It is backward-looking harm. We judge the death bad from a temporal perspective that includes both the living and the ceasing to live. When we say his death at 30 was tragic, we mean his life as a whole was worse than it should have been, was cut short, was deprived of its natural span. This debate gets very technical in contemporary philosophy of death. Both sides have sophisticated arguments. What matters for understanding Epicurus is that his argument, while clever and psychologically helpful for some people, does not definitively prove death is not bad. It works only if you accept certain assumptions about harm, time, personal identity, and the relationship between experience and value. There is also the symmetry argument we mentioned earlier. Lucretius, the Roman poet who systematized Epicurean philosophy in his epic poem On the Nature of Things, formulated this beautifully. Look back at the eternity before you were born. Were you harmed by not existing during the age of dinosaurs, during ancient Egypt, during the rise of Greek civilization, before your birth? No, you were not harmed because you did not exist to be harmed. The infinite past of your non-existence was not bad for you. Why should the infinite future of your non-existence be any different? Both are periods of non-existence, symmetrical in all relevant respects. This argument is powerful, but has been challenged. People's intuition suggests there is an asymmetry. We do not regret not being born earlier, but we do regret that we will die and not see the future. Why this asymmetry if the two non-existences are equivalent? Several explanations have been proposed. One is that we have a natural forward-looking bias. We care more about future events than past ones. Another is that prenatal non-existence is not a deprivation, because it is not the ending of an existing life, while post-mortem non-existence is the termination of an ongoing, valuable process. Another is that we care about the trajectory of our lives, about continuation and completion in ways that make ending worse than never beginning. Epicurus would likely say these intuitive asymmetries are irrational, products of psychological bias rather than genuine differences. But explaining away deeply held intuitions is difficult, and many people find the symmetry argument unpersuasive despite its logical elegance. There is one more dimension to Epicurean thinking about death that deserves attention: the value of mortality itself. Some ancient philosophers, like the Stoics, saw death as neutral. Epicurus went further, suggesting that mortality might actually be essential to the good life. If you were immortal, every moment would be less precious because you would have infinite moments. Nothing would be urgent, nothing would require commitment, you could always postpone, delay, reconsider. The fact that life is finite gives it structure, meaning, urgency. It forces choices, prioritization, commitment. Bernard Williams, a 20th-century philosopher, explored this idea in his essay The Macropulos Case. He argued that immortality would be boring, that you would eventually exhaust all meaningful experiences and be left with endless repetition. Mortality is not a flaw to be fixed, but a feature that makes life livable. Whether Epicurus explicitly made this argument is debated, but it is consistent with his philosophy. If ataraxia is the goal, and if ataraxia is achievable in finite time, then additional time beyond that adds nothing essential. Immortality would not be an improvement, just an extension without purpose. This is a profound reframing. Death is not an enemy to be feared or defeated, but a boundary that gives life shape. The question is not how to escape death, but how to live well within the time you have. And living well means achieving tranquility through philosophy, simplicity, and friendship. The practical application of Epicurean death contemplation is a kind of memento mori practice, though gentler than some traditions. The Epicurean regularly reflects on mortality not to become morbid or depressed, but to maintain perspective, to remember what truly matters, to avoid wasting life on unnecessary pursuits. Knowing you will die should make you less anxious, not more, because it clarifies priorities. If you have limited time, you cannot afford to spend it chasing false goods like fame or wealth or power. You must focus on what actually produces happiness, simple pleasures, philosophy, friendship. Death is the great clarifier, burning away illusions and leaving only what genuinely matters. Modern existentialists like Heidegger and Sartre made similar points. Authentic existence requires confronting mortality, what Heidegger called being toward death. Only by acknowledging your finitude can you take responsibility for your life and live authentically rather than conforming to social expectations. Epicurus anticipated this existential insight, but without the angst. For Heidegger, confronting death produces anxiety, angst, that opens up authentic existence. For Epicurus, understanding death produces tranquility, ataraxia, that enables the good life. Both see mortality as central to meaning, but they draw opposite emotional conclusions. Which is right probably depends on temperament and philosophical commitments. If you believe life has no intrinsic meaning and we must create meaning through projects and commitments, then mortality might be anxiety-inducing because it threatens those projects with ultimate meaninglessness. If you believe pleasure is the only good and pleasure is fully achievable within a finite lifespan, then mortality is not threatening but natural. The final question is whether Epicurus provides adequate resources for facing not just your own death, but the death of loved ones. This is where the philosophy seems weakest. Grief is natural, the pain of loss is unavoidable, and it is not clear that understanding Epicurean philosophy makes grief much easier. Epicurus would say that grief is natural pain, the loss of pleasure from your friend's company, but it should be limited. Excessive grief comes from false beliefs, that your friend is suffering now, that they are being punished, that you will be judged for failing them, that life without them is unbearable. Correcting these false beliefs should reduce grief to its natural minimum, the simple pain of missing someone, which will fade with time. But is this adequate? Many people feel that grief is not just pain to be minimized, but a meaningful response to love, a testament to the value of the relationship. Trying to eliminate grief too quickly might seem like denying the importance of the person lost. Epicurus might respond that he is not advocating eliminating grief, but eliminating the disturbance and false beliefs that make grief worse than it needs to be. You can honor your friend's memory, treasure your time together, and slowly heal without torturing yourself with irrational fears about their fate or your own inadequacy. This is probably as good as any philosophy can do with grief. Acknowledge its reality, provide tools for managing the irrational components, encourage gradual healing while respecting the natural process. Death remains the ultimate challenge for any philosophical system claiming to offer the good life. Part 9. Living Epicureanism. Philosophy for Epicurus was not an academic exercise, but a way of life, a daily practice, a comprehensive method for achieving and maintaining well-being. Understanding the theory is necessary but insufficient. You must embody the philosophy, make it habitual, integrate it into every aspect of existence. This is why Epicurus created the garden as a living community, a practical laboratory for his ideas. The garden was not just a school, but a household, a chosen family, an intentional community organized around philosophical principles. Members lived together, ate together, worked together, studied together, supported each other through illness and hardship. The daily rhythm of Epicurean life centered on a few core practices. First, philosophical discussion and study. Not formal lectures and passive listening, but active dialogue, questioning, examining beliefs, working through problems together. Everyone participated regardless of education or social status. Women like Themista and Leontion were teachers, not just students. Slaves participated as equals in discussion, even if not in legal status. The content of study included physics, ethics, and what we might call psychology or cognitive therapy. Students memorized the principal doctrines, the 40 key maxims summarizing the philosophy. They studied Epicurus's letters to various students, which provided both theoretical instruction and practical guidance. They read his systematic treatises, though these were probably too technical for beginners. But memorization was not rote learning. It was internalization, making the teachings automatic and immediately accessible. When anxiety arises, you need the right philosophical tool ready in your mind. Death is nothing to us, or do not fear the gods, or natural and necessary desires are easily satisfied. These become mantras, cognitive interventions that interrupt irrational thought patterns. The practice included what Epicurus called parrhesia, frank speech. Students were encouraged to confess their anxieties, bad habits, false beliefs to their teachers and fellow students. This was not therapy in the modern sense, with professional distance and confidentiality, but mutual self-disclosure and correction among friends. If you notice a friend chasing wealth obsessively, you have a duty to gently point out that they are pursuing an unlimited desire that will never bring satisfaction. This requires enormous trust, which is why friendship was so central. You can only accept frank criticism from someone you trust completely, someone who clearly cares about your welfare, someone who is not judging you but helping you. The garden cultivated this level of intimacy through shared life, shared meals, shared vulnerability. Meals were particularly important in Epicurean practice. Not banquets or feasts, but simple shared food with good conversation. The act of eating together reinforced community, provided opportunity for philosophical discussion, and demonstrated that pleasure does not require luxury. Bread, vegetables, water, occasionally cheese or wine, these were sufficient for satisfaction and enjoyment. Archaeological evidence from Herculaneum shows that Epicurean texts included instructions for proper dining, reclining positions, appropriate topics of conversation, how to moderate eating and drinking, how to enjoy food without overindulgence. The symposium, the communal meal with philosophical discussion, was a central ritual. There was also attention to physical health, though details are sketchy. Epicurus himself suffered from poor health, which may have influenced his emphasis on mental pleasure outweighing bodily pain. But the general principle was clear. Take reasonable care of the body to minimize pain and maintain the capacity for pleasure, but do not become obsessed with health or fitness as ends in themselves. Exercise, diet, rest, medical care when necessary, these are all instrumentally valuable for maintaining the bodily equilibrium necessary for ataraxia. But extreme asceticism or athletic training or pursuit of physical beauty are unnecessary and potentially distracting from the real goal. The Epicurean day probably included some labour, growing food, and maintaining the property, though we lack detailed accounts. Manual work was not denigrated as it was in aristocratic Greek culture. If it contributes to self-sufficiency and reduces dependence on market forces, it serves the philosophical goal. The garden aimed for modest self-sufficiency, not complete isolation, but significant independence from the political and economic systems of Athens. There was also time for what we might call meditation or contemplation, though Epicurus did not use these terms. Reflecting on philosophical teachings, examining your own mental state, catching false beliefs as they arise, consciously cultivating gratitude for simple pleasures. These are all practices mentioned in the texts. Philodemus wrote about the importance of recalling past pleasures, especially pleasant times with friends. Memory becomes a source of present pleasure, and cultivating positive memories provides resources for enduring present difficulties. This is cognitive behavioral therapy's emphasis on positive memory recall as a tool for managing depression and anxiety. The Epicurean also practices gratitude, consciously appreciating what they have rather than focusing on what they lack. Each simple pleasure, a drink of cool water on a hot day, a conversation with a friend, a beautiful sunset, is noticed and savoured. This mindful appreciation of present experience is central to maintaining ataraxia. Modern mindfulness meditation shares this emphasis on present moment awareness and non-judgmental acceptance. Though Epicureanism lacks the formal meditation techniques of Buddhism, the underlying psychology is similar. Much suffering comes from mental elaboration, from adding thoughts and judgments to raw experience. Returning attention to direct sensory experience, to the simplicity of the present moment, reduces that suffering. The Epicurean community also had rituals and celebrations. They gathered monthly to commemorate Epicurus's birthday, not out of worship, but out of gratitude for the teaching and the teacher. This was not religious ceremony, but communal celebration, reaffirming bonds and shared values. They also met on the 20th of each month, the date associated with Epicurus and his circle. These rituals served important social and psychological functions, creating rhythms and markers in time, strengthening group identity, providing occasions for reflection and renewal. Even a philosophical system based on reason and nature benefits from ritual structure and communal celebration. What about solitude versus community? Epicurus emphasized both. You need community for security, friendship, philosophical discussion, practical support. But you also need solitude for reflection, study, self-examination. The ideal is probably a balance. Most of your time with close friends in the community, but with space for individual contemplation and privacy. The motto, "Live unknown, lathe biosas," reflects this balance. Avoid public life, political engagement, seeking fame or recognition. But do not become a hermit either. Live within a small community of friends, known intimately by them but unknown to the larger world. This protects against the disturbances of public life while providing the benefits of social connection. How do you become an Epicurean? The ancient texts suggest a gradual process of education and practice. You begin by reading or hearing the basic teachings, perhaps attending lectures or discussions. If this resonates, you seek deeper instruction, studying the principal doctrines, Epicurus's letters, and key texts. You begin practicing the cognitive techniques, examining your desires, challenging false beliefs, cultivating simplicity. Eventually, if you are committed, you might join an Epicurean community or create one. This was the ideal, living with like-minded friends who support your practice and whom you support in turn. But even without a formal community, you can live Epicurean principles individually or with one or two close friends. The process takes time. Epicurus compared it to medical treatment. You do not get healthy instantly. You must follow the prescription consistently over time. Bad mental habits, irrational fears, unnecessary desires, these are deeply ingrained and take persistent effort to change. But the promise is that with practice, ataraxia becomes stable, reliable, a lasting state rather than a fleeting experience. What about backsliding and failure? The texts acknowledge that this is common. You understand the philosophy intellectually, but still find yourself anxious about money, chasing status, fearing death, getting angry or jealous. This is where the community becomes crucial. Friends notice when you are falling back into old patterns and gently correct you. There is also the question of how to interact with non-Epicureans. Do you proselytize, trying to convert others? Do you retreat completely from mainstream society? The historical evidence suggests a middle path. Epicureans maintained some interaction with broader society, had family members who were not Epicurean, engaged in necessary economic transactions. But they did not actively seek to convert the masses or reform society. This sometimes gets criticized as elitism or quietism. If you have found the path to happiness, do you not have an obligation to share it widely? Why should this wisdom be limited to small garden communities? Epicurus might respond that most people are not ready for philosophy. They are too attached to conventional values, too embedded in political and social systems, too resistant to radical change. You can offer the teaching to anyone interested, but you cannot force it on the unwilling. Modern applications of Epicureanism face unique challenges. We do not live in small agricultural communities. We cannot easily achieve self-sufficiency. We are embedded in global economic and political systems that require participation. We have mortgages, careers, legal obligations, family responsibilities that limit how fully we can adopt ancient practices. But the core principles remain applicable. Distinguish necessary from unnecessary desires, cultivate simple pleasures, prioritize friendship, challenge irrational fears, pursue tranquility over achievement, practice gratitude and mindfulness. You do not need to live in a commune to be Epicurean. You can apply the philosophy within whatever life circumstances you inhabit. Some modern intentional communities explicitly draw on Epicurean principles. Co-housing developments where people have private spaces but share common facilities and regular meals. Friend groups who structure their social lives around philosophical discussion and mutual support. Digital communities maintaining Epicurean practices across distances. The 21st century may actually be ripe for Epicurean revival. Consumer capitalism promotes endless desire and constant dissatisfaction, the very things Epicurus warned against. Social media creates comparison and competition. Political polarization creates anxiety and anger. Climate change creates existential fear. Against all this, Epicurean tranquility through simplicity, community and philosophical understanding offers a compelling alternative. Part 10. The Critics Strike Back. No philosophy survives 2,000 years without fierce opposition, and Epicureanism faced perhaps the most sustained and vicious criticism of any ancient school. Understanding these criticisms is essential both for intellectual honesty and for appreciating the real limitations and tensions in the system. The attacks came from multiple directions: philosophical rivals, religious authorities, and eventually Christian theologians who saw Epicureanism as the ultimate enemy. First, the Stoics, who were Epicurus's primary philosophical opponents for centuries. The Stoics agreed that achieving tranquility was the goal of life, but they had a radically different conception of how to get there and what it meant. For Stoics like Zeno, Chrysippus, and later Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, tranquility comes from virtue, from living according to nature and reason, from accepting whatever happens as part of divine providence. The Stoics attacked Epicurean hedonism as fundamentally confused about human nature. Humans, they argued, are rational beings, and our good lies in exercising rationality excellently, which is virtue. Pleasure is not the goal, but a mere side effect of virtuous action. In fact, focusing on pleasure leads you astray, making you dependent on external circumstances and bodily states beyond your control. The wise person, the Stoic sage, is indifferent to pleasure and pain, wealth and poverty, health and sickness, even life and death. These are indifferents, neither good nor bad in themselves. Only virtue is truly good, only vice truly bad. If you understand this and cultivate virtue, you become invulnerable to fortune, possessing an inner citadel of tranquility that nothing external can disturb. The Stoics mocked Epicurean physics, especially the swerve. How can this random atomic deviation explain free will? It just makes human choice arbitrary and inexplicable, not free and rational. The Stoics preferred determinism with rational understanding. Everything happens according to divine reason. The logos and freedom consists in understanding this necessity and accepting it willingly. They also attacked Epicurean withdrawal from political life as cowardly and selfish. Humans are social beings, citizens of a cosmic polis, with duties to our fellow humans and to the universal rational order. Retreating to a garden to pursue personal tranquility while the world suffers is moral failure, abandonment of responsibility, inhuman selfishness. The Epicurean response was that Stoic virtue is just another form of false belief, causing unnecessary suffering. The Stoics claim to be indifferent to pain, but this is either false, they do suffer but refuse to admit it, or inhuman, because natural pain aversion is part of being a sentient creature. Stoic acceptance of whatever happens as divinely ordained is just another form of irrational belief in providential gods, no better than conventional religion. Moreover, Stoic political engagement brings constant disturbance, dealing with fools and scoundrels, making difficult decisions with imperfect information, experiencing inevitable failure and disappointment. The Stoic claim that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, regardless of external circumstances, is simply false to human experience. People tortured on the rack are not happy, no matter how virtuous they are. This debate between Epicureanism and Stoicism continued for centuries, with neither side convincing the other. Both systems offered comprehensive philosophies of life with internal coherence and practical application. Your choice between them depends largely on which fundamental claims you find more plausible. Is pleasure or virtue the primary good? Is the universe rationally ordered or random? Are humans fundamentally social or fundamentally individual? The Platonists offered different criticisms. Plato himself had died before Epicurus established his school, but later Platonists attacked Epicurean materialism as philosophically naive and morally dangerous. If there is no immaterial soul, no eternal forms, no transcendent good, then there is no ultimate foundation for morality, no objective truth, no higher purpose to existence. Epicurean ethics reduces to subjective preference. You pursue pleasure because it feels good, but there is no reason why you should pursue it or why it is objectively valuable. Different people might find pleasure in different things, including cruelty or vice, and Epicureanism has no grounds for saying they are wrong as long as they achieve ataraxia. Epicureans responded that Platonic forms are metaphysical fantasies with no empirical evidence. We can explain ethics perfectly well through human nature and natural sentiments without positing invisible transcendent entities. And Platonism has its own problems. If the good exists in some transcendent realm separate from the physical world, how does it guide human action in this world? The Platonic system is both empirically unverifiable and practically useless. But the most sustained and ultimately most historically successful attack came from Christianity. The early church fathers saw Epicureanism as the ultimate enemy, more dangerous than Stoicism or Platonism, because it denied divine providence, denied immortality, denied that suffering has redemptive meaning, denied everything Christianity taught. Tertullian, Augustine, and other church fathers launched systematic attacks on Epicurean philosophy. They argued that Epicurean physics was atheistic, despite Epicurus's nominal belief in gods. Gods who do nothing and care about nothing are not really gods at all, just Epicurean atheism with a fig leaf. This removes all foundation for morality, all meaning from suffering, all hope for justice beyond this life. Epicurean hedonism was portrayed as the philosophy of pigs, of people who reduce human existence to bodily pleasure and animal satisfaction. Christianity taught that humans are made in God's image, have immortal souls, are called to transcend bodily desire through spiritual discipline. Epicureanism denied all this, making humans just sophisticated animals with no higher purpose or destiny. The denial of afterlife was particularly offensive to Christians. If there is no judgment after death, no heaven or hell, then wickedness goes unpunished and virtue goes unrewarded. This life's injustices are never rectified. Martyrs die pointlessly, tyrants win, the universe is morally indifferent. This is intolerable nihilism that destroys all meaning and hope. Christians also attacked Epicurean withdrawal from public life as shirking Christian duty to be salt and light in the world, to care for the poor, to spread the gospel, to build God's kingdom. The garden was selfish isolation, refusing to bear witness or serve suffering humanity. These attacks were so effective that Epicureanism virtually disappeared in Christian Europe. Epicurus's works were not copied by Christian scribes. His philosophy was taught only as an example of error to be refuted. For more than 1,000 years, Epicureanism survived mostly through hostile accounts in Christian texts. The rediscovery of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things in 1417 by Poggio Bracciolini sparked Renaissance interest in Epicureanism. This poem, the fullest surviving account of Epicurean philosophy, circulated among humanist scholars and influenced thinkers like Montaigne, Gassendi, and Hobbes. But open advocacy of Epicureanism remained dangerous well into the Enlightenment. Modern critics have added new objections. Utilitarian philosophers like John Stuart Mill argued that Epicurus was right, that pleasure is the good, but wrong about how to maximize it. Mill distinguished higher and lower pleasures, intellectual and cultural pleasures versus bodily pleasures, arguing that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Epicurean ataraxia, tranquil contentment, might be a lower pleasure than the higher pleasures of art, philosophy, science, and moral achievement, even when these involve difficulty and disturbance. Nietzsche attacked Epicureanism from another angle. It represents slave morality, the philosophy of people too weak to embrace life's struggle and pain. Real human flourishing requires engagement, risk, overcoming, creating meaning through struggle. Epicurean withdrawal into safe simplicity is life-denying cowardice, refusing the challenge of existence. Existentialists argued that Epicurean ataraxia is inauthentic, an escape from the anxiety and responsibility that define genuine human existence. Heidegger saw anxiety as the fundamental mood that reveals our being toward death and opens up authentic possibilities. Trying to eliminate anxiety, as Epicurus recommends, is fleeing from the truth of our condition. Feminist critics have noted that while Epicureanism was progressive in including women, it still took place within patriarchal structures and did not fundamentally challenge gender oppression. The Garden allowed women to participate in philosophy, but it did not advocate for women's political equality or challenge the subordination of women in broader society. Its quietism meant accepting rather than resisting systemic injustice. Marxist critics attacked Epicurean individualism and withdrawal as bourgeois ideology that serves ruling class interests. If oppressed people seek individual tranquility rather than collective liberation, they will not challenge power structures. Epicureanism offers personal happiness within an unjust system rather than working to transform the system itself. Environmental critics might argue that Epicurean focus on minimizing personal disturbance makes us indifferent to ecological destruction as long as we personally maintain tranquility. If you live simply in your garden, you might ignore the climate crisis, mass extinction, and environmental collapse happening beyond your walls. All these criticisms raise genuine problems. Epicureanism may indeed undervalue engagement, struggle, moral obligation beyond self-interest, collective action, and higher human potentials. Its reductionism, treating everything as atoms and void, pleasure and pain, may miss essential dimensions of human experience. But defenders point out that many criticisms misunderstand or caricature the philosophy. Epicureanism is not crude hedonism or selfish withdrawal, but a sophisticated system for achieving stable well-being through understanding, virtue, and community. Its naturalism and empiricism were scientific progress, not nihilism. Its individualism created space for personal autonomy against oppressive social demands. The tension between criticism and defense reveals something important. No philosophical system is perfect or complete. Every system makes trade-offs, emphasizes some values at the expense of others, has strengths and weaknesses. Epicureanism deserves both appreciation for its insights and honest acknowledgement of its limitations. Part 11. Where Epicureanism fails. Now we must turn inward and examine the internal tensions and genuine failures within Epicureanism itself, even granting its own assumptions. These are not external criticisms from rival philosophies, but problems that emerge from the logic and application of Epicurean principles themselves. First, the foundational problem, the relationship between pleasure as criterion and ataraxia as goal. Epicurus claims pleasure is the only good and pain the only evil. But he also claims that the highest pleasure is ataraxia, the absence of pain and disturbance. This creates immediate confusion. Is pleasure the sensation of satisfaction, the kinetic pleasure, or is it the state of equilibrium, the katastematic pleasure? If pleasure is primarily kinetic, then ataraxia is not maximum pleasure, but absence of pleasure, a neutral state between pleasure and pain. But Epicurus insists ataraxia is itself a pleasure, the highest pleasure. This seems to redefine pleasure to mean something like whatever we should pursue, losing the empirical grounding that made hedonism plausible in the first place. The problem becomes acute when Epicurus claims that once you achieve ataraxia, you cannot increase pleasure, only vary it. But this contradicts common experience. A person in tranquil equilibrium who then has a pleasant conversation, or eats a delicious meal, or experiences beauty, seems to experience increased pleasure, not just varied pleasure. If these active pleasures do not increase overall pleasure beyond ataraxia, why pursue them at all? Epicurus might say they vary pleasure without increasing it, but this distinction seems arbitrary. It works only if you redefine pleasure to mean life satisfaction or well-being rather than phenomenal feeling. But then the empirical clarity of hedonism is lost. We are back to debating abstract conceptions of the good life. Second problem, the tension between egoism and friendship. Epicurus claims every action is ultimately motivated by self-interest, by pursuit of one's own pleasure. But he also claims true friendship involves caring for the friend's welfare for their own sake, not instrumentally. These seem incompatible. The attempted reconciliation that your friend's welfare becomes part of your own through psychological integration is psychologically plausible but philosophically unsatisfying. It suggests that friendship is ultimately selfish. You care about your friend only because their happiness makes you happy. If you could be happy without caring about them, you would have no reason to care. This seems to miss what is valuable about friendship: genuine concern for another person independent of how it makes you feel. The problem is especially acute with sacrificial friendship. If you die to save your friend, you experience no pleasure from their survival because you are dead. Epicurus says you choose this because living with the knowledge of betraying them would be unbearable. But this assumes you would survive, which contradicts the scenario. The decision must be made anticipating death, knowing you will not experience any future pleasure. How can this be explained by pleasure maximization? Some Epicureans bite the bullet. Genuine self-sacrifice is irrational within Epicurean theory. If you truly understand that death ends all pleasure, you would never rationally choose death to save another. But this seems morally bankrupt, unable to account for one of the most noble forms of human behavior. Third problem, the limitation to present pleasures and pains. Epicurus argues that only present pleasure and pain matter because you can only experience the present. Past and future do not exist, so they cannot affect you except through present memory and anticipation. But this seems false to human experience and problematic for planning and prudence. If only present matters, why save for the future? Why forgo present pleasure for future benefit? Epicurus answers that present pain of anxiety about the future outweighs present pleasure of spending now, so prudence is still rational. But this seems ad hoc, constructed to preserve common sense rather than genuinely following from the principle. More deeply, humans care about their lives as narratives, as coherent wholes with meaning and trajectory. We care about accomplishment, legacy, life projects that extend beyond present experience. Epicureanism seems unable to account for this temporal dimension of human existence, reducing everything to momentary states. Fourth problem, the gap between theory and practice regarding desire management. Epicurus says eliminate unnecessary desires, depend only on natural and necessary desires. But human psychology does not work this cleanly. Once you have experienced luxury, comfort, variety, it is extremely difficult to return to simplicity and find it equally satisfying. Hedonic adaptation works both ways. You adapt to good things and come to need them. You adapt to bad things and come to tolerate them. The Epicurean answer, cultivate the right mental habits from the beginning, is not helpful for people already embedded in consumer culture. And it seems psychologically unrealistic to claim that bread and water can be as satisfying as gourmet cuisine if you just have the right attitude. The body has needs and preferences that philosophy cannot simply override. Fifth problem, the quietism and political indifference. Even granting Epicurean goals, the withdrawal from public life seems strategically mistaken. Your tranquility depends on social stability, rule of law, protection from violence. If everyone withdraws to gardens, who maintains these public goods? And if they collapse, your garden provides no protection. Moreover, you have friends and loved ones who are affected by political decisions, wars, economic crises. Their suffering affects you through empathy and concern. Complete withdrawal from politics is therefore impossible if you genuinely care about others. You might minimize political engagement, but total avoidance seems both impractical and inconsistent with friendship. Sixth problem, the treatment of pain and suffering. The claim that severe pain is brief and chronic pain is mild is empirically false. Many conditions involve severe chronic pain. The claim that mental pleasure can always outweigh physical pain is also questionable. Extreme pain overwhelms consciousness, making philosophical reflection impossible. Epicurus himself may have been lucky, experiencing pain that was severe but came in manageable episodes with periods of relief. But many people face continuous severe pain that destroys quality of life regardless of philosophical understanding. The philosophy provides little help for these situations beyond acceptance, which is really just Stoicism under another name. Seventh problem, the arbitrariness of the swerve. This is perhaps the most criticized aspect of Epicurean physics. The swerve is introduced solely to save free will, with no independent evidence or theoretical justification. It makes atomic motion random at crucial moments, which undermines the whole project of natural explanation. If atoms can swerve for no reason, why not other miraculous events? It opens the door to precisely the kind of supernatural thinking Epicurus wanted to eliminate. Modern physics does include genuine randomness at the quantum level, but this does not obviously support free will in the way Epicurus needed. Quantum randomness is not the same as volitional choice. The relationship between micro-level indeterminacy and macro-level free will remains deeply puzzling. Eighth problem, the gods. Epicurus's theology is unstable, trying to maintain gods while making them completely irrelevant. If gods exist but do nothing and care about nothing, why maintain the concept at all? It seems like Epicurus is trying to avoid legal prosecution for atheism while actually being functionally atheist. But then why not just admit atheism? The answer seems to be that Epicurus thought people would not accept pure atheism, so he offered a modified theism that preserved the word God while eliminating the features that cause fear. But this is intellectually dishonest. verbal sleight of hand rather than genuine argument. Ninth problem. The social contract theory of justice has holes. If justice is just mutual agreement for advantage, then we have no obligations to people with whom we have no contract. Future generations, distant people, the severely disabled who cannot reciprocate, non-human animals. This seems to exclude too much from the moral circle. Moreover, the powerful might calculate that breaking the contract and accepting punishment, or arranging to avoid punishment, provides more pleasure than keeping it. Why should the strong accept equality with the weak if they can dominate instead? Social contract theory without moral foundations beyond self-interest seems unstable. 10th problem. The perfectionism implicit in the sage ideal. Epicurus describes the sage who has achieved perfect ataraxia, who always chooses wisely, who is unperturbable. But this ideal is so far beyond normal human capacity that it becomes useless as a guide. It is like telling someone to be perfectly healthy by never getting sick, perfectly wise by never making mistakes. Actual humans are fallible, emotional, imperfect. We need philosophy that helps with partial progress, not just an unreachable ideal. Finally, there is the meta-problem. Epicureanism claims to be based on nature and reason alone, no faith required. But it actually requires enormous faith in a comprehensive metaphysical system, in particular claims about atomic physics, the nature of consciousness, the non-existence of afterlife. If any of these fundamental claims is wrong, the entire structure collapses. This makes it more dogmatic than it claims to be, more vulnerable to empirical refutation, less universally applicable. These failures and tensions are significant. They show that Epicureanism, for all its insights, is a flawed system with gaps, internal inconsistencies and limited applicability. It works best for certain personality types in certain circumstances, people who are naturally inclined towards simplicity, who value tranquility over excitement, who live in relatively stable societies with supportive communities. But acknowledging failures does not mean abandoning everything. We can take what is valuable in Epicureanism, the emphasis on simple pleasures, the importance of friendship, the techniques for managing anxiety, the critique of unlimited desires, while recognizing that it does not provide a complete or final philosophy of life. It is a resource, a perspective, a set of tools, not a dogma to be accepted wholesale. Part 12. Modern Epicureanism. We arrive at the crucial question. What does Epicureanism offer us today, 23 centuries after Epicurus founded his garden? Is this merely historical curiosity, an ancient system superseded by modern philosophy and psychology? Or does it contain insights that remain vital, perhaps even more relevant now than in the ancient world? The answer is complex. In some ways, Epicureanism has been vindicated by modern developments. In other ways, modernity has revealed its limitations. And in still other ways, contemporary problems call for precisely the kind of wisdom Epicurus offered. Start with the vindications. Modern neuroscience has essentially confirmed Epicurean materialism about the mind. Consciousness is produced by brain activity, not by an immaterial soul. Every aspect of mental life, perception, emotion, memory, reasoning, intention, has neural correlates. Damage the brain and you damage the mind. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. There is no empirical evidence for any consciousness existing independent of functioning brains. This supports Epicurus's claim that death is the end of experience, that there is no afterlife to fear. Of course, this does not prove that death is not bad for you in the deprivation sense, but it does eliminate specifically religious fears about judgment and punishment. Evolutionary psychology supports Epicurean insights about human nature and motivation. We are shaped by natural selection to seek pleasure and avoid pain, because these guided our ancestors towards survival and reproduction. Basic pleasures like food, safety, social connection are hardwired into our biology. This grounds ethics in nature rather than in cultural construction or divine command. Modern happiness research has produced findings remarkably consistent with Epicurean claims. Studies consistently show that beyond a moderate income sufficient for basic needs, additional wealth produces little additional life satisfaction. This supports Epicurus's claim that natural and necessary desires are easily satisfied, and that chasing unlimited desires is futile. Research also confirms that close relationships are the strongest predictor of well-being, much more important than wealth, fame, or achievement. This validates Epicurean emphasis on friendship as the highest good. Loneliness and social isolation are major risk factors for physical and mental illness, while strong social connections promote health and happiness. Studies on hedonic adaptation show that people return to baseline happiness levels after both positive and negative events. We adapt to luxury and come to take it for granted, just as Epicurus predicted. This suggests that cultivating satisfaction with simple pleasures rather than chasing ever more impressive ones is psychologically wise. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective modern psychological treatments, uses techniques remarkably similar to Epicurean therapy. CBT identifies irrational beliefs causing distress, challenges them with evidence and logic, provides alternative interpretations, encourages behavioral experiments to test beliefs. This is essentially what Epicurus did. Examine your fears and anxieties, trace them to false beliefs about gods, death, or the nature of happiness. Replace those beliefs with accurate ones based on evidence and reason. Mindfulness-based therapies also echo Epicurean practice. Attending to present sensory experience, accepting rather than resisting, distinguishing raw sensation from mental elaboration, cultivating gratitude for simple pleasures, these appear in both traditions. The modern voluntary simplicity movement draws directly on Epicurean principles. People choosing to downshift from consumer culture, reduce work hours, live with less stuff, focus on experiences and relationships rather than possessions, are essentially Epicureans, whether they know it or not. The tiny house movement, minimalism, anti-consumerism, FIRE, financial independence, retire early, these all embody Epicurean insights about what truly brings satisfaction. Environmental concerns make Epicurean simplicity even more urgent. Consumer capitalism is destroying the planet through overconsumption and waste. We need philosophical frameworks that value sufficiency over excess, that find satisfaction in less rather than always demanding more. Epicureanism offers precisely this, a philosophy of enough, of finding the maximum pleasure with minimal resources. The loneliness epidemic in modern societies makes Epicurean emphasis on community and friendship desperately relevant. People are more connected digitally but more isolated socially than ever before. We have thousands of social media friends but few close relationships. We live alone or in nuclear families rather than in extended communities. We move frequently for work, breaking ties and starting over. The result is epidemic loneliness, depression, anxiety, suicide. The Epicurean answer, create intentional communities of friends who share values and support each other, is exactly what many people are seeking. Co-housing developments, intentional communities, chosen families, regular dinner clubs, study groups, these are all modern attempts to create what the garden provided, deep, sustained connection with people who know you and care about you. The crisis of meaning in secular modernity also makes Epicureanism relevant. If there is no God, no afterlife, no cosmic purpose, where do we find meaning? Traditional religion provided answers, but for many these are no longer credible. Nihilism and despair threaten when meaning structures collapse. Epicureanism offers an alternative. Meaning does not come from transcendent purpose, but from living well, from experiencing pleasure and avoiding pain, from cultivating tranquility, from friendship and community. Life does not need external validation to be worth living. The good life is its own justification, its own meaning, its own purpose. This is philosophical naturalism that affirms life without requiring supernatural backing. But modernity also reveals Epicurean limitations. The global scale of contemporary problems, climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, requires collective action and political engagement that Epicurean quietism cannot provide. We cannot all withdraw to gardens while the world burns. We need philosophies that motivate engagement, activism, sacrifice for common good. Technological development has created pleasures and possibilities Epicurus never imagined. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, space exploration, these raise questions about enhancement, transformation, transcendence that Epicurean focus on simple natural pleasures does not adequately address. Should we pursue technological pleasures even if they are unnatural? Should we enhance ourselves beyond biological limits? Should we create artificial pleasures through direct brain stimulation? Epicureanism seems to counsel caution about all this. Stick with natural pleasures, do not create new needs. But is that wisdom or mere conservatism? Maybe humans should embrace enhancement and transformation. Maybe we should engineer ourselves for greater pleasure, deeper connection, longer life, cognitive enhancement. These questions require ethical frameworks beyond what Epicurus provided. The experience machine thought experiment challenges Epicurean hedonism. Robert Nozick asked, if you could plug into a machine that simulates perfect experiences, giving you maximum pleasure while your body lies in a tank, would you? Most people say no, suggesting we value something beyond subjective experience, perhaps authenticity, reality, actual relationships and achievements. This suggests pleasure is not the only thing that matters, or that pleasure must be of the right kind, grounded in reality rather than simulation. Epicurus might agree that virtual pleasure is less valuable than real pleasure, but it is unclear whether his philosophy has resources to explain why. Modern psychology also complicates the picture. We now know that happiness involves more than just pleasure and absence of pain. Flow states, engagement in challenging activities, sense of meaning and purpose, personal growth, these contribute to well-being in ways not captured by pleasure alone. Positive psychology distinguishes hedonic well-being, pleasure and satisfaction, from eudaimonic well-being, meaning and self-actualization, suggesting both matter. This echoes the ancient debate between Epicureans and Aristotelians about whether pleasure or flourishing is the goal. Maybe both were partly right. Maybe well-being has multiple dimensions, not reducible to a single factor. So, what is modern Epicureanism? It cannot be simple revival of ancient doctrine. It must adapt to modern knowledge, modern problems, modern possibilities, while preserving core insights. The core principles still relevant. Pleasure matters. Simple pleasures are often most satisfying. Unlimited desires create unhappiness. Friendship is essential. Fear of death and gods causes unnecessary suffering. Tranquility is valuable. Empirical evidence should guide belief. Modern Epicureanism might look like this. Live simply with minimal dependence on consumer goods. Cultivate deep friendships and community. Practice gratitude and mindfulness. Examine and challenge anxiety-producing beliefs. Pursue meaningful work aligned with values. Engage politically on issues that matter while protecting personal well-being. Accept mortality while living fully. Ground ethics in naturalism without supernatural beliefs. This is not pure Epicureanism. It incorporates insights from other traditions, makes different trade-offs, adapts to modern circumstances. But it draws on Epicurean wisdom as a major resource. Several contemporary philosophers have developed neo-Epicurean positions. Michel Onfray argues for sensual atheistic hedonism, informed by Epicurean materialism, but embracing modern pleasures. Catherine Wilson explores how Epicurean corpuscular philosophy anticipated modern science and how Epicurean ethics remains relevant. Hiram Crespo develops contemporary Epicurean community practices and interpretations. Modern Epicurean communities exist, though small and scattered. Online groups study and discuss Epicurean philosophy. Some attempt to create local communities inspired by the garden. Intentional communities sometimes explicitly draw on Epicurean principles. The Society of Epicurus and similar organizations promote Epicurean ideas and practices. But Epicureanism has not achieved mass appeal in the modern world. It seems too quiet, too modest, too accepting for an age that values ambition, transformation, disruption. It counsels contentment when culture promotes constant striving. It recommends simple pleasures when luxury is affordable and available. It urges withdrawal when engagement seems urgently needed. Yet perhaps this is precisely why it matters. The dominant culture is making us miserable, chasing endlessly after more, comparing ourselves to impossible standards, destroying the planet and each other in the process. We need alternatives. We need philosophies that say enough is enough, that value being over having, that find wealth in friendship rather than possessions. Epicureanism will never be the dominant philosophy because it does not promise power, glory, transformation, transcendence, certainty about ultimate meaning. It offers something more modest, but perhaps more achievable. A good life within the limits of nature, human nature, mortality. Not everything you might want, but everything you truly need. Not immortality, but mortal life well lived. Not cosmic purpose, but earthly pleasure, friendship, tranquility. In an age of anxiety, in a time of climate catastrophe and social fracture, in a world of artificial needs and manufactured desires, in a culture of comparison and competition, maybe the ancient Greek philosopher, with his simple garden, has something essential to teach us. Not everything, not the final answer, but something we desperately need. The wisdom that happiness is possible, is natural, is within reach, if only we understand what we truly need and free ourselves from what we do not. That is Epicurus's gift across the centuries, the possibility of tranquility through understanding, the promise of pleasure through simplicity, the path to the good life through nature, reason, and friendship. Whether we accept that gift depends on whether we can overcome our cultural conditioning, our endless wanting, our fear of missing out, our belief that more is always better. It depends on whether we have the courage to say, this here now is enough. I am content, I am pleased,